Most people assume that letting go should be straightforward once we intellectually understand it is good for us. We tell ourselves we should release the old hurt, the outdated dream, the relationship that no longer fits, or the version of ourselves we have outgrown. Yet something in us resists, sometimes fiercely. This resistance is not usually a sign of weakness or lack of insight. It is the result of deep biological, psychological, and identity-level wiring that has protected human beings for a very long time. From an evolutionary perspective, the tendency to hold on tightly made sense. Our ancestors survived by staying attached to what worked: familiar territory, trusted group members, stored resources, and mental models that helped them predict danger. Releasing something too quickly could mean losing protection, status, or the ability to learn from past threats. The parts of our brain and nervous system that manage attachment and vigilance did not evolve for a world of rapid change, abundant options, and psychological safety. They evolved for environments where letting go could carry real costs. When we try to release something significant today, those ancient circuits can still activate, creating a felt sense of threat even when no physical danger exists. On top of this biological layer sits a powerful psychological one. We often fuse parts of our identity with what we are holding: the story of what someone did to us, the grievance we replay, the "I should have been further by now" narrative, or the dream we refuse to update becomes woven into how we understand ourselves. Releasing it can feel like erasing a chapter of our own story or losing the explanation for why we are the way we are. Many people discover that beneath the difficulty of letting go lies a quieter fear. If I release this, who will I be without it? The mind sometimes prefers the familiar pain of holding on to the uncertainty of not knowing who we become after release. There are also secondary gains that keep us attached even when we consciously want to let go. Holding on can provide a sense of control in an unpredictable world. It can give us moral clarity or a feeling of being right. It can protect us from having to feel the grief, disappointment, or vulnerability that true release would bring. These gains are rarely conscious, yet they exert strong influence. Our nervous system often chooses known suffering over unknown freedom because the known at least feels predictable. This is why simply deciding to let go, or even understanding intellectually why we should, rarely produces lasting release. The resistance lives deeper than the thinking mind. It lives in the body's protective patterns, in the stories we have built our sense of self around, and in the subtle payoffs we receive for staying attached. When we begin to see these layers with clarity and compassion rather than frustration, something important shifts. We stop treating ourselves as the problem and start working with the intelligence that has been trying to keep us safe all along. What makes this especially tender is that the very same protective mechanisms that make letting go difficult have also helped us survive and care deeply. The part of us that grips is often the part that once loved enough to hold on. Understanding this doesn't instantly dissolve the difficulty, but it does change our relationship with it. We begin to approach release not as an act of force or self-improvement, but as a gradual process of signaling to our whole system that it is safe to loosen the grip. This protective intelligence and the identity-level reasons we hold on have been recognized and addressed by human beings across many cultures and centuries. Long before we could speak about nervous systems or identity fusion, traditions around the world developed sophisticated ways of understanding and working with exactly this struggle. Their insights offer us maps that remain remarkably relevant and practical today.
Long before modern psychology or neuroscience gave us language for why release feels so difficult, human beings across vastly different cultures were already wrestling with the same core question: how do we stop gripping so tightly without losing our ability to care, act, and live fully? What they discovered was not a single technique, but a profound reorientation of how we relate to life itself. In the Buddhist tradition, the central insight is that attachment, or upadana, is one of the primary roots of suffering. The teaching does not ask us to stop caring about people or outcomes. It points to the specific way we grasp at them, trying to make impermanent things permanent and to control what cannot ultimately be controlled. Practices such as meditation on impermanence and the cultivation of equanimity were developed precisely to loosen this grip in a gentle, sustainable way. The emphasis is on seeing clearly rather than on forcing ourselves to feel differently. Taoist wisdom approaches the same territory through the principle of Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action or non-forcing. Rather than pushing against the current of life, one learns to sense the natural flow and move with it. Classic stories such as the old farmer whose horse runs away and whose neighbors offer judgment about whether this is good or bad fortune illustrate the wisdom of releasing premature conclusions and fixed expectations. The Taoist path suggests that much of our suffering comes from insisting that life arrange itself according to our preferences, and that a deeper strength emerges when we stop exhausting ourselves in that fight. The Stoic philosophers arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion through the lens of reason. They taught the dichotomy of control. Some things are within our power, and some are not. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius repeatedly emphasized that our suffering usually stems not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. The practice was to release what lies outside our control, while investing fully in what remains within it. This was never presented as cold indifference, but as the only sane way to preserve one's inner freedom in the middle of an unpredictable world. In the yogic traditions, the concept of Ishvara Pranidhana describes a conscious surrender or offering of one's efforts to something larger than the individual will. This is not passive resignation, it is an active alignment that reduces the exhausting burden of having to make everything happen through personal force alone. When combined with steady practice and ethical living, this surrender creates a different quality of strength, one that is steady because it is no longer dependent on constant self-willed effort. What unites these traditions is the recognition that fighting reality usually multiplies our pain, while a mature form of release frees energy that can then be used more wisely. They did not teach detachment from life, they taught a different quality of engagement, one in which we participate fully without the exhausting need to control every outcome. These maps were developed through centuries of careful observation of the human heart and mind. They remain practical because they address the same patterns we still encounter: the tendency to grip, the fear of what will happen if we stop gripping, and the surprising relief that comes when we learn to hold life more lightly. This ancient understanding of how resistance itself deepens suffering points us toward a crucial insight that changes how we work with letting go in our own lives.
One of the most consistent discoveries across both ancient traditions and contemporary psychology is that our resistance to what is happening often creates more suffering than the original event itself. The first arrow is the unavoidable pain of life, a loss, a disappointment, a change we did not choose, or a limitation we cannot escape. The second arrow is the one we add through our reaction. We fight, deny, replay, ruminate, or refuse to allow what has already occurred. This second arrow is entirely optional, yet most of us fire it repeatedly without realizing we are the ones holding the bow. When we resist, we tighten around the experience. That tightening keeps the pain circulating in our minds and bodies long after the actual event has passed. A difficult conversation becomes days or weeks of mental replay. A disappointment becomes a story about how life or other people are against us. The original pain was already difficult enough. The resistance turns it into prolonged inner conflict and exhaustion. Modern approaches such as acceptance and commitment therapy have carefully studied this dynamic and reached the same conclusion the ancient traditions pointed to. The more we struggle with our thoughts and feelings, the more entangled we become with them. What we resist tends to persist. What we allow has the chance to move through us and lose its charge. This does not mean we should like or approve of everything that happens. It means we stop adding unnecessary layers of fighting on top of what is already here. Many people discover that when they soften their resistance even slightly, the original difficulty becomes more workable. They still feel the sadness or frustration, but they are no longer also fighting themselves for feeling it.
This creates a different quality of space. From that space, wise action often becomes clearer and more possible than it was while we were in the middle of inner warfare. The relief that comes from reducing resistance is not dramatic or instantaneous. It tends to arrive in quiet increments. We notice that we are no longer replaying the same conversation at 2 in the morning. We observe that a situation we were dreading has lost some of its emotional charge. We realize we have more energy available for the parts of life that actually need our attention. These small shifts compound over time. They do not require us to become someone who never feels pain or disappointment. They require us to become someone who no longer adds extra suffering on top of the inevitable difficulties of being alive. Understanding how resistance multiplies suffering naturally leads us to examine the physiological dimension of our capacity to release. Our nervous system plays a central role in whether letting go feels possible or threatening.
Letting go is often discussed as a mental or spiritual process, yet it is also deeply physiological. Our nervous system constantly evaluates whether the environment is safe enough to relax its defenses. When it perceives threat, even psychological or imagined threat, it shifts into protective states. In these states, gripping, vigilance, and control feel more adaptive than release. The body prioritizes survival over long-term well-being, and the parts of the brain involved in flexible thinking and emotional regulation have reduced access to resources. This is why we can intellectually know that holding on is costing us peace and still find ourselves unable to let go. A regulated nervous system operates differently. When we feel sufficiently safe, the ventral vagal pathways associated with connection and calm become more available. From this state, release feels less like a threat to our survival and more like a natural movement. The same situation that felt impossible to release yesterday can feel workable today, not because the external circumstances changed, but because our internal state shifted. This is why practices that help the body register safety often make letting go easier than trying to convince ourselves through reasoning alone. Simple signals such as slower breathing, gentle orienting to the present environment, placing a hand on the heart or belly, or engaging in rhythmic movement can communicate safety to the nervous system. These are not merely relaxation techniques, they're ways of updating the body's assessment of threat so that the protective grip becomes less necessary. Over time, repeated experiences of safety while facing difficult emotions or situations rewire our baseline capacity for release. We become people whose systems are less quick to assume that letting go equals danger. This physiological dimension does not replace psychological insight or spiritual understanding. It supports them. When the body feels safer, the mind has more room to see clearly, and the heart has more capacity to soften. Many people who have struggled for years with letting go discover that adding nervous system-aware practices changes the entire process. What once required enormous willpower begins to happen more naturally because the body is no longer treating release as a threat. Our nervous system's protective responses also help explain why we sometimes continue holding on, even when doing so clearly hurts us. The system is not malfunctioning, it is following very old instructions about what keeps us safe. It can feel confusing and even frustrating to watch ourselves hold on to something that is clearly causing pain. We may intellectually understand that releasing a particular story, relationship pattern, or expectation would bring relief, yet something in us continues to grip. This persistence is rarely simple stubbornness. It usually reflects deeper protective functions that have not yet been updated or honored. One common reason we hold on is that the grip provides a sense of identity or control. The story of what happened to us or the way we believe life should have unfolded can become central to how we explain ourselves. Releasing it can feel like losing a reference point for who we are. Another reason is protection from grief or vulnerability. Truly letting go often requires feeling the sadness, disappointment, or fear that we have been avoiding by staying attached to how things should be. The holding, while painful, can feel safer than the alternative of fully feeling what is underneath it. There are also subtle secondary gains. Holding on can give us a feeling of being right or morally clear. It can maintain a sense of connection to someone or something we are not yet ready to lose. It can protect an old self-image that we are not yet prepared to update. These gains are rarely conscious, yet they exert real influence on our behavior. Our system often chooses the familiar pain of gripping over the unknown territory of release, because the familiar at least feels predictable. When we approach these patterns with genuine curiosity instead of judgment, something important becomes visible. The part of us that refuses to let go is usually trying to protect something it perceives as precious: safety, identity, connection, or dignity. This does not mean we should never release. It means we release more effectively when we acknowledge the protective intention rather than fighting against it. Many people find that speaking to or writing to the part that is holding on with respect and acknowledgement allows it to relax more than direct attempts at force ever could. This compassionate understanding of why we hold on makes the practical work of letting go in daily life both gentler and more effective.
Letting go becomes more accessible when we stop treating it as a single dramatic event and begin approaching it as a collection of small, repeatable practices that we can return to throughout ordinary days. These practices do not require perfect conditions, strong motivation, or long periods of time. They require only consistent, gentle attention applied in moments when the stakes feel manageable. One of the most reliable entry points is bringing kind awareness to the body's experience of gripping. We can notice where we are holding tension: the jaw, the shoulders, the chest, the belly, and simply name it inwardly without trying to force relaxation. Ah, here is the gripping. This noticing itself often creates a small amount of space. Another practice is the quiet internal reminder of impermanence. This too shall pass. Used not as a bypass, but as a factual observation, it can interrupt the mind's tendency to treat temporary states as permanent. We can also practice micro-releases during the day. This might mean consciously letting go of a minor expectation when plans change, releasing a judgment about someone else's behavior, or handing over a worry before sleep rather than carrying it into the night. These small acts send repeated signals to our system that release is possible and that we can survive the feelings that come with it. Over time, they build a different kind of muscle memory. Another helpful approach is to thank what we are releasing for what it once gave us before we let it go. Even patterns that now cause suffering often served a purpose at some point in our lives. Acknowledging that service can reduce the unconscious loyalty that keeps us attached. We do not have to agree with or like what we are releasing. We simply recognize its role in our story so that we can more cleanly choose to set it down. These practices work best when we keep the bar low enough that consistency feels possible even on difficult days. The goal is not dramatic transformation in a single moment. It is the gradual rewiring of both our nervous system and our identity through repeated, manageable experiences of release. Over months and years, these small acts compound into a noticeably lighter way of moving through life. This practical foundation makes it easier to navigate one of the most common points of confusion in this territory: the difference between giving up and true surrender.
Many people avoid the language of surrender because they associate it with giving up, weakness, or passive resignation. These are not the same thing, and understanding the difference protects us from both forced positivity and from bitter collapse. Giving up usually arises from depletion or despair. It often carries a sense of defeat and an underlying resentment toward life or toward ourselves. It is a closing down rather than an opening. True surrender, by contrast, arises from clarity and a mature assessment of what is actually within our power. It is an active choice made from a place of dignity rather than exhaustion. When we truly surrender, we are not saying that the situation is acceptable or that we do not care about the outcome. We are saying that we have seen clearly what lies within our control and what does not, and we are choosing to stop exhausting ourselves on the latter. This kind of surrender frequently frees up significant energy that can then be directed toward wise action, clearer boundaries, or simply living more fully in the present. The Stoics captured this distinction when they emphasized focusing only on what is up to us. The Yogic traditions spoke of offering the fruits of our actions rather than remaining attached to specific results. In both cases, the emphasis is on releasing the grip on what cannot be controlled while remaining fully engaged with what can. This is not detachment from life. It is a more precise and sustainable form of engagement. Recognizing this difference helps us avoid two common traps. The first is forcing ourselves to let go from a place of self-criticism or spiritual bypassing, which usually creates more resistance. The second is staying stuck in resentment or victimhood because we fear that any form of release means we have given up. True surrender sits in the middle path. It is honest about what hurts and honest about what we cannot change. From that honesty, a quieter and more durable strength becomes available. This clarity about the nature of genuine surrender makes the process of consciously releasing what no longer serves us more straightforward and more compassionate.
Releasing what no longer serves us becomes more effective when we treat it as a conscious, multi-stage process rather than a sudden decision or an act of willpower. The first stage is usually a clear and honest inventory. We ask ourselves, with as little judgment as possible, what we are currently carrying that costs more than it returns. This might be a relationship pattern, a belief about our own worth, a habit that once helped but now drains, an old goal that no longer fits who we are becoming, or a story about the past that keeps us small. The inventory itself can bring relief because it makes visible what has been operating unconsciously. Once something has been identified, many people find it helpful to acknowledge what that thing once gave them. Even patterns that now cause suffering often served an important function at some point. They may have protected us, helped us belong, given us a sense of meaning, or allowed us to survive difficult circumstances. Thanking them, even silently or in writing, can reduce the unconscious loyalty or guilt that sometimes keeps us attached long after the original need has passed. We are not condoning what needs to be released. We are simply recognizing its role in our story so that we can more cleanly choose to set it down. From this place of acknowledgement, we can make a deliberate decision to release. This decision can be supported by simple rituals that mark the transition. Writing down what we are releasing and burning or burying the paper, speaking the release out loud, or creating a small symbolic gesture that represents letting go. The ritual is not magic. It is a way of involving the body and the deeper mind in a process that the thinking mind alone often cannot complete. After the release, it is important to create space for what we actually want more of. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the mind often fills empty space with old patterns unless we intentionally invite something new. This might mean clarifying the values or qualities we want to embody, taking one small action aligned with those values, or simply resting in the spaciousness that release creates. Over time, this cycle of inventory, acknowledgement, conscious release, and intentional replacement becomes a natural rhythm rather than a dramatic event. This process of conscious release supports us in meeting one of life's most consistent realities: constant change and uncertainty.
Life is movement. Everything that arises eventually changes or passes. Our bodies age, relationships evolve, careers shift, and circumstances we once counted on prove temporary.
Yet much of our suffering comes from trying to make the changing nature of life hold still. We grip tightly to moments, roles, health, or outcomes, and then feel betrayed or anxious when they inevitably move. The peace we seek is not found in finally gaining enough control to stop change. It is found in developing trust in our own capacity to meet whatever arises. This trust is not abstract. It is built through repeated lived experiences of releasing and discovering that we are still here, still capable, and still whole on the other side. Each time we soften our grip on how things should be and allow ourselves to feel what is actually here, we add to an inner reservoir of evidence that we can handle change. Over time, this evidence becomes more convincing than the mind's stories about how dangerous uncertainty is. Practical support for this trust includes beginning the day with a quiet intention to meet whatever comes with as much presence as we can muster, rather than with a rigid plan for how the day must unfold. It includes using the breath as a constant, portable reminder that we can ride waves of feeling and circumstance without being swept away by them. It also includes deliberately practicing release in low-stakes situations so that the muscle is stronger when higher-stakes changes arrive. Peace in uncertainty does not mean we never feel fear, sadness, or disorientation. It means those feelings no longer have to derail us or consume all our energy. We learn to hold them more lightly, to let them move through us, and to return to presence more quickly. This is not a one-time achievement. It is a gradual shift in our default relationship with the fact that nothing stays the same. The more we practice riding change rather than resisting it, the more we discover that uncertainty itself is not the enemy of peace. Our resistance to uncertainty is. This understanding of how to meet change with greater steadiness brings us to the culminating practice of living with an open hand.
The art of non-attachment is frequently misunderstood as emotional coldness or not caring about people and outcomes. In reality, it is closer to the opposite. It is the developed capacity to engage fully with life, to love deeply, to commit wholeheartedly, to work toward meaningful goals, and to care about the world, while holding our grip lightly enough that we do not shatter when things change, as they inevitably will. Living with an open hand means we can receive what comes and release what goes without losing our center. We can invest in relationships without trying to control the other person's feelings or choices. We can pursue important work without being enslaved by its results. We can hold a vision for our life while remaining flexible about the form that vision actually takes. This quality of engagement is both more joyful and more sustainable than the exhausting alternative of trying to make life conform to our preferences at every turn. This way of living does not emerge from a single insight or decision. It is cultivated through the accumulated experience of the practices we have explored, understanding why we grip, learning from ancient maps of surrender, reducing unnecessary resistance, working with the nervous system's need for safety, acknowledging the protective reasons we hold on, practicing small daily releases, distinguishing true surrender from giving up, consciously letting go of what no longer serves, and building trust in our capacity to meet change. Over time, these experiences reshape both our inner state and our outer behavior. We become people who can love without clinging, who can care without controlling, and who can act without being attached to specific outcomes. The open hand can still hold. It simply does not have to crush what it holds or panic when it eventually needs to let go. This is not detachment from life. It is a more precise and spacious form of participation in it. The freedom that comes from living with an open hand is quiet rather than dramatic. It shows up in the way we meet a changed plan without collapse, in the way we can celebrate someone else's success without comparison, in the way we can release an old identity without crisis, and in the way we can keep showing up for what matters, even when the results are uncertain. This freedom is not the absence of difficulty. It is the presence of a steadier, kinder relationship with the difficulties that life continues to bring. It is the freedom of a heart that has learned, through practice, that it can let go and still remain whole.